Stand for the gospel reading. So at the beginning of this new year, I've chosen a reading which seems to me to encapsulate Jesus' final preparation for his public ministry. So he's been trying to work out his cosmology. He's figuring out who he is, who the neighbor is, who God is, and what his mission is. And these three little stories together from Mark's Gospel encapsulate the final preparation and the beginning of the ministry. It happened in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. On coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit, like a dove, descending upon him. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." At once the Spirit drove him out into the desert, and he remained in the desert for 40 days, tempted by Satan. He was among wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. After John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God. This is the time of fulfillment. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the good news. Words inspired by God. So I'm going to make up a story for you this morning. You know that I never make up stories? Never? Okay. This is going to be totally fictitious with fictitious characters to whom I'll give fictitious names. So once upon a time, there was a little boy. He was about just 15 months old. And he was visiting with his grandma. And I'm going to call this fictitious kid, I call him Ari. And he's in his grandma's house. And one day he stumbles upon the coffee table and there's a jigsaw puzzle in a box. And he pulls it asunder, opens it up, and scatters it like confetti around the house. He's having a blast. And there is a dog living in this house to whom I give the fictitious name Timmy. And Timmy hears the kalele and he runs in to join in the fun. And now he loves Ari. He sees what's happening. So he decides to join in the festivities. So he goes back out into the kitchen and he rescues an old cornflakes box off the kitchen table and brings it in. And between himself and Ari, they shred it into 117 pieces, which they mix in with the jigsaw puzzle and scatter all over the house. At this stage, Grandma, who shall remain nameless, came in and saw what's happening. Their grandma loves Timmy and grandma loves Ari. So she stood there and she laughed. At this stage, Timmy and Ari are getting tired. So they do what dogs and little kids do. Ari goes down, puts his hands out, his head in his hands, and his butt in the air, and he falls asleep. And Timmy imitates it. Timmy puts his paws out, his head down, his rump in the air, and Timmy goes to sleep. So they're having a siesta, the two of them. So at this stage, Grandma decides to clean up the mess. So she goes to the closet, takes out a broom and a dustpan, and she starts sweeping all the pieces into the dustpan, thinking that they're all parts of the cornflakes box. And she's just about to dump them, and suddenly she sees there's a jigsaw puzzle piece inside. She says, "Oh, wait a minute." So she comes back, clears the dining room table, and dumps all the pieces out onto the table. And then she sits down and starts separating out the pieces of the cornflakes box from the jigsaw puzzle box. Meanwhile, the kid and the dog are still snoozing. So she's got time in her hands. So she starts assembling the jigsaw puzzle. Totally fictitious story. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to make 3 main points this morning. The first one I will call epistemology, how we know what we know, or in other words, how you gather all the pieces into the dustpan. That's basically epistemology. All the data, the pieces are the data, and the dustpan is awareness. So how do we gather all the pieces, all the data into our awareness? The second point I'll make is finding the truth. So how do you distinguish the pieces of the cornflakes box from the real jigsaw puzzle? That's the second point I'll make. And the third point is cosmology, how we assemble our models. Now that you've figured out what are the real pieces of the jigsaw, how do you set about putting the jigsaw puzzle together? So they're the 3 points I'll make this morning. So the first point, the dustpan of awareness and the data. How do we gather stuff together? Epistemology is the study of how people know what they know. And basically, it seems to me, it happens in one of three ways. We learn stuff because some authority figure told us it was so. Our parents, teachers in school, the priest during a homily, the scientists, the talking heads on TV. We get our information from authority figures whom we trust. That's the first way in which we assemble data. The second way is that we have personal experiences of stuff. And that brings a lot more data into the dustpan. And then the third way is sometimes we figure stuff out for ourselves. It's not so much that we're having experiences as much that internally we're trying to assemble data and try to make sense of the data. So they're basically the three ways in which we kind of put pieces into the dustpan, our data into our awareness. Now the problem is that none of these three ways is infallible. Authority figures frequently get it wrong. To begin with, all authority figures are basically getting their information in one of the same three ways. They're getting it from previous authorities, who got it from previous authorities, who got it from previous authorities. Now, we had a game as kids. The name we gave to it was Chinese whispers. I don't know what you call it, where I whisper something to Patricia, and she whispers it to Karen, and Karen passes on to Kate, and finally it gets down to Lawrence. And by the time it gets to Lawrence, it's a totally different story. What did you guys call it? Telephone, okay. So it's basically the same idea. So basically, when you trust an authority figure, the authority figure got their information from another authority figure who got it from another authority figure. Now, over time, the message gets corrupted, and the circumstances change, and therefore, the data may not be relevant anymore. So that's the first problem, if you trust authority figures. And they frequently get stuff really badly wrong. So most of human history, the scientists believed that we lived in a geocentric universe. That planet Earth was the center of the whole thing, and it all revolved around us. For most of human history, science taught us that was true. Or you take church authorities. The Roman Catholic Church, the one true church instituted by Jesus Christ, which is totally infallible, presided over by an infallible guy sitting on a throne in Rome, told us of a place called Limbo. Do you remember Limbo? Oh, yeah. Okay. Limbo allegedly was a place where unbaptized babies went and spent eternity. They couldn't go to heaven because they hadn't been baptized, but they couldn't go to hell because they hadn't committed any sin. So somebody is changing their nappies. Angels sent down, Tuesdays and Fridays to feed them and change their nappies. What happened to Limbo? Limbo very quietly disappeared some years ago. There was no proclamation. The church didn't say, oops, we made a mistake, it was wrong. They just, they sent buses down to Limbo and they evacuated all the kids and brought them up to heaven. So authorities frequently get it wrong. Personal experiences sometimes can get it wrong as well. We're all subject to delusions and illusions. How many of you, for instance, saw the sunrise this morning? Nobody did. Because the sun doesn't rise. It's an illusion, The earth is spinning on its own axis. It gives the illusion, that the sun is coming up and going down. So we all think we see sunrises, but none of us has ever seen a sunrise. How often have you gone into an art gallery and you look at a portrait section, some great paintings? Let's say the Louvre. You've gone and you've seen, the great painting. What's the famous painting? The Mona Lisa. And you go in and you're standing in front of it. She's looking directly at you. And then you go over to a corner and you look at something else and you glance around and she's still looking at you. Wow. And you go over to the other end of the room and you look back and she's still looking at you. Now, how come? Everybody else in the room thinks that the Mona Lisa is looking at her or at him. So you're inferring a three-dimensional reality from a two-dimensional surface. And so constantly our own experiences play tricks on us, so we can't trust them completely. Nor can we trust the fact that we figure things out for ourselves. Have you ever had a situation where it's the end of a really, really long work day and you have an hour to drive home? You sit into your car and you're on the freeway in kind of non-stop traffic and you look down at your petrol gauge and you realize, oh my God, it's flashing. I got an empty tank. And you're thinking, wow, I remember in the past, even when it shows that it's empty, I can get about 18 or 19 more miles out of it. I don't want to get off the freeway, and try to find a gas station and then try to rejoin it again. I think I can make it home. There's a gas station near home and I'll gas up tomorrow. And then 14 miles further on, you go, but, and you hope you can get over onto the verge. Has that ever happened to you? So you figure stuff out, and you get it wrong. So none of these methods is infallible. Now, if we try to cross-fertilize them, authority figures, personal experiences, and working stuff out for ourselves, maybe we'll be wrong less frequently. So that's basically how we get the stuff onto our dustpan. That's epistemology. That's my first point. The second point then is finding the truth. Now that you've got all these pieces on the dustpan, and like grandma, you realize, oh my God, there are jigsaw puzzle pieces inside with the cornflakes box pieces. How can I separate out the sheep from the goats? And you sit at the table, you scatter all the pieces, and you examine them all, and you put them into one of two categories: the cornflakes box or the jigsaw puzzle, truth or false. Now this is very interesting. How do you go about sorting out the truth from the falsity? Thomas Aquinas said very famously one time, he said, truth is found only in the judgment. Faced with any proposition, every single one of us has to assign the proposition to one of two categories. Either it's true or it's not true. So how do you go about making that assessment? Now, most of us do it on almost an unconscious basis. It's a knee-jerk reaction to stuff. And basically, there are two criteria that we employ. The first one is, it depends on who told it to us. If we hear something new, which is a little bit different for us, it depends on who told us. If we heard it from an authority figure, we're more likely to believe it, even if it sounds, crazy. If we hear it from a layperson, we're less likely to believe it. And if we hear it from somebody whom we don't like, we probably won't believe it. So the first thing is, who told it to me? And the second thing is, how well or badly does it align with my previous thinking? Is it totally out of left field, or is it fairly close to what I already believe? So using these two criteria, either consciously or knee-jerk way, we assign it to one of two categories. Now I'll give you a weird example. So for instance, there's a conspiracy going around at the moment, that the earth is actually flat. Any of you guys come across that? Yeah, there's a big conspiracy going around right now. There's a famous basketball player is getting behind it. Who's this big guy that played with the Lakers years and years ago? Shaquille O'Neal. Was it? Shaquille O'Neal. He drives it from Atlanta to California regularly. He says, if the earth is flat, I can't see any kind of curvature to the earth. So the whole bunch of people. Now, this theory, suppose you read this in a newspaper on Safeway as you're checking out at Safeway, one of these rags. Are you going to believe it? Probably not. If Stephen Hawking suddenly wrote a book called The Flat Earth, and he began to demonstrate reasons why it might be flat, you'd be much more likely to take it seriously. So when you come across any new data, you're going to immediately try to, who told it to me, and how well or badly does it align with what I already believe? The same is true even if you have personal experiences. If you have a personal experience where you had a vision of the Virgin Mary, are you going to tell anybody? They're going to bring the guys with the white coats and lock you up. Or you were abducted by ETs, and you want to tell somebody that you were abducted by ET. Who are you going to tell? You say, oh my God, I know it's a real experience, it really happened to me, but if I tell anybody, I'm going to be locked away. So even when you have experiences yourself, you still won't make them part of your cosmology. So these are the criteria we use. And when we work stuff out for ourselves, sometimes if the results of our working stuff out make us unpopular or pariahs in society, we keep our mouths shut. So there are lots of constraints on how we're sorting the data into believability and falsehood. That's my second point. Now, suppose you finally manage to separate all the pieces out, and you have a bundle that you think belongs to the jigsaw, and a bundle belongs to the cornflakes package that you're going to dump. Point number 3 then is cosmology. And cosmology is, how do you now organize the real pieces, the true pieces, into the jigsaw puzzle? So how do you go about this process? Now, for the vast bulk of us, all of the data are actually acquired unconsciously. We got it from our parents, we got it from school teachers, but mostly it's unconscious. And you put us in any situation, and we will access that model unconsciously and respond accordingly. And if I said to you, Patricia, why did you say that? Patricia will say, sounds like the right thing to say. I have no idea. My youngest sister, Dervla, when she was very small, there's a 22-year gap between us. If she did something dumb, I would say, Dervla, why did you do that? And she would say, that's the way. That's the way. That was enough explanation. That's the way. And so, mostly we can't explain our behavior. We think, we did it because it was the appropriate thing to do. But it's been driven by some kind of an internalized cosmology, which has been unconsciously acquired and is now, in this instance, being unconsciously accessed as well. So it's very, very difficult for us to get a grip in it, because mostly we're doing it at an unconscious level. which is why all the great teachers, if there's one virtue they emphasize more than anything else, more importantly even than love, it is coming awake. So people like Socrates and Plato will make statements like, man, know thyself, or the unexamined life is not worth living. Or Gautama Siddhartha will give himself the nickname the Buddha, which literally means, I am awake. Or Jesus Christ will tell parables like, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he wouldn't go to sleep. And so again and again and again you get the notion that the first great virtue actually is waking up. So when you wake up, you're trying to bring to consciousness the models or the philosophies or the personal cosmologies by which you're living your life. I'm going to use a kind of a metaphor for that. Suppose you are now living in the same house in which you were born, 30, 50, 60, 70 years ago. You've never lived in any other house. And you haven't traveled a whole lot. And I say to you, what's your house like? And you say, my house? It's just my house. Because you haven't seen anybody else's house. You don't know whether your house is big or small. You have nothing to compare it with. You don't know whether it's, warm or cold, damp or dry, hospitable or unfriendly. You have no idea until you visit a whole bunch of other homes. But suppose someday you decide, you know what? I want to build my own dream home. So how do you go about doing it? The first thing is you have to have some kind of an idea of what is my ideal dream home. What would it look like? A mental image of what it would be. And then secondly, you have to commit it to some kind of a blueprint. You've got to work out the plans. Then thirdly, you have to assemble materials. And then fourthly, you have to engage a workforce to put all the pieces together. And then you get your dream house. Now, in some senses, a personal cosmology is a little bit like that. Most of us are living in a house that we've lived in since we were born, and we have no idea what the house looks like because we've never compared it with anybody else's house. And for the most part, most of us have never built our own home. We've never created a cosmology from scratch out of our own kinds of ideas. So this is kind of the wake-up call. But when you do it, immediately you're going to run into problems because maybe you won't even believe your own dream, your own cosmology, and very probably other people with whom you share it won't believe it either. There's a great satirical novella written in 1884 by a guy called Edwin Abbott, an English school teacher. It was called Flatland. And it's actually a satire on Victorian England at the time. The discrimination against women and discrimination based on class. The English are very class conscious. So there's the lower class, and then the working class, and then the middle class, and then the upper class, and then the elite, and then the aristocracy, and then the royalty. It's very, very segregated. And he was writing, his novella was actually a critique of that, but he did it under the guise of a geometrical conundrum. And in the story, what happens is, it's called Flatland, a two-dimensional surface. Imagine like it's a piece of paper, two-dimensional. Yeah. And everybody lives on this. It's either a one-dimensional creature or a two-dimensional creature. The women are one-dimensional creatures. They only consist of line segments. The men are two-dimensional figures. They could be squares, or triangles, or parallelograms, or stuff like that. So there's only one dimension or two-dimensional creatures in this world of Flatland. And one day, a being from a third dimension, from a sphere, comes upon Flatland and tries to engage. And he meets a square, and he's trying to persuade the square that he actually exists. And the square says, no, you don't. I can't see you. And you must say, I'm a three-dimensional being. And the square says, it's ridiculous. There's only one-dimensional beings, women, and two-dimensional beings, men. Nothing else can exist. And the sphere says, I'll prove it to you. I'm going to penetrate your plane. I'm going to pass right through it. So the sphere begins to penetrate the plane. And initially, all the square can see is the little dot. And then as it begins to pass through, the dot widens out into a circle. And as it goes further and further, the circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's halfway through. And then as it keeps going, the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller until again it's a dot, and then it disappears. And so finally the square says, wow, you really exist? There is a third dimension? And the sphere says, yeah, I wonder if I can kind of take you there and show you. And so he manages to make a convert of the square and to take him into the third dimension, where he encounters cylinders, and cubes and stuff like that. He can't believe it. Oh my God, there's a third dimension. And then he begins thinking, I wonder, is there a fourth dimension and a fifth dimension? So the square says to the sphere, maybe there's a fourth dimension and a fifth dimension. And the sphere says, don't be ridiculous. There can't be anything more than A third dimension. So he gets thrown out of three-dimensional land back down to flat. He's now a pariah. So that's what happens when we try to work with a new cosmology. Whether you're doing this on an individual basis for yourself, and you share with somebody else, are you doing this because you're part of an organization and you're trying to make the organization shift, like for instance, John the 23rd attempted to do during Vatican II, to move the biggest church of its time into a new paradigm, into a new cosmology, and the reactions against him. So you're going to deal with flat land on a personal basis and on a community basis when you begin shifting your cosmology. So be very aware of that. And what you'll find is that cosmologies range the entire gamut of possibility. We started off at the beginning with a very anthropocentric cosmology in which human beings are the only living entities, intelligent life forms in the universe. And we're the only beings that have souls. There's no life anyplace else. We are it. So it's a really anthropocentric model, and everything is about human beings. And then we oscillated from that wildly across to a cosmology of hopelessness, a Jean-Paul Sartre or a Camus kind of thing, where we live in a world in which has been driven by some kind of a random algorithm which is meaningless and hopeless. And there's no point. You just consumerism is the only answer to that. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And in between somewhere, you get a cosmology of religion. A group that tells you, there's a heaven and there's a hell, and will tell you how to get to one place and how to avoid the other place. And then there's kind of scientism that promises utopia, immortality, and delivers, in fact, dystopia, weapons of mass destruction, ecological disaster, and the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. So where along that spectrum are you going to develop your cosmology? Now, as you develop your cosmology, I suggest, if you're serious about it, you have to become a serial killer. You have to commit 4 murders in order to kind of develop your cosmology. The first thing you got to kill is your ego. And I don't mean you can survive without an ego, but it means that your ego is not the center of your psyche. You realize the ego is the servant of the soul. But as long as the ego is dominant, you're going to get into all kinds of problems. A very famous Hindu mystic one time said, all human suffering lies in the gap, the tiny gap between the ego and the soul. So the first murder, you have to kill the ego in the sense that you have to realize where the ego fits in the scheme of things. The second murder is that you got to kill your father. By your father, I mean your culture of origin. Whatever culture you emerged from, whether it's an Irish culture or an American culture, whatever it is, you have to kill that. By which I mean that it is not the only way to look at life. I don't mean that you have to really abandon it, but you have to transcend it. And I mean that in an epigenetic model. Epigenetic meaning that all subsequent stages go beyond but incorporate all the previous stages. In the same way that when a tree is sending twigs into the universe and leaves on the twigs, it's not abandoning its root system. They continue to feed each other. Chlorophyll goes from the top down and nutrients go from the bottom up. So transcending does not mean abandoning, but you have to go beyond your culture of origin. The third murder is you have to kill your guru. There is no teacher who can take you all the way. Some teachers are experts in some parts of the journey. Other teachers are experts in other parts of the journey. There is no teacher on planet Earth who is an expert on your life. You are unique, and therefore there are places you can only go on your own. So at some stage, you've got to kill your guru, which does not mean disrespecting. It means realizing just the limitations of any teacher. And the fourth piece is you have to kill your God. Meister Eckhart will say very famously, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. As soon as you create a theology that you believe in completely, that this totally explains who God is, get rid of it, because you're going to stultify at that stage. God is ineffable. All we can do is create slightly less inaccurate maps of the terrain, but there is no map which is a substitute for the terrain. So you have to commit 4 murders. And then finally, as you begin to write your cosmology, I think a really good way to start is by asking yourself 4 questions. And as you answer these 4 questions, you've got all of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle necessary to create a new cosmology for yourself in 2018. And the first question is, who is God for you? What do you mean when you say God? The second question you ask is, who am I? Whom do I really believe myself to be? Thirdly, you ask yourself, and who is my neighbor? And then finally, what is my mission? What have I come down here to do? Now, I suggest that you're going to harvest as much data as you need from answering these 4 questions. So is God, some kind of a distant, demanding deity for you? Or is God like a cosmic CPA who's keeping accounts? Or is God, Santa Claus for you? Or is God an ineffable mystery for you? And when you think about you yourself, who am I? Your parents told you who you were. Your teachers told you who you were. The mass media told you who you are. Your churches told you who you are. Whom do you believe yourself to be? You've told yourself stories about yourself. Are they true? You've identified with your body, or with your job, or with your marriage. Is that who you really are? And when you think about your neighbor, who is neighbor for you? Is neighbor the guy at the other side of the white picket fence, or the guy who votes for the same party as you do? Or is your neighbor also in the Middle East wearing a suicide belt? Is that part of your neighbor? Are all sentient beings your neighbor, or just the human family? And finally, what is your mission? Was your mission to become a bus driver, or a doctor, or an artist? None of these are your mission. These are professions you adopt. But your mission is about the acquisition of virtue of various kinds. So how do you harvest these questions in order to gather the data to create a cosmology that will explain to you who you are and what you've come to do, who your neighbor is and who God is in this time to come? So specifically for this homily, I created an exercise. So I want you to imagine for a few minutes a blackboard. I got a blackboard up here. And I've got 5 columns in this blackboard, vertical columns. And I've got a whole bunch of rows. So it's a matrix. So the first column is your age divided up into 7-year chunks, between 0 to 7, from 7 to 14, 14 to 21, etc. Down that column, each row is a separate section, 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, etc. Some people are going to need 2 pages for this exercise. The second column is, during that particular period, from 0 to 7, or from 21 to 28, whom did I think God was? Ask yourself, at each stage, who was God for me at each of these stages? The third column is, who did I think I was at each of these stages? Between 7 and 14, who did I believe myself to be? The next column is, who did I think was neighbor to me? What do I mean by the word neighbor, at each of these age categories? And then finally, what did I think my purpose or my mission was in each of these 3 stages? So I'm going to do that exercise as a group this morning. I'm going to do just a little brief guided visualization in which I'm going to walk us through that exercise and have you fill in those categories for yourself so that you're generating the data you need on the dustpan of awareness to separate the wheat from the goat, the what is it? The wheat from the chaff. And the goats from the sheep. Goats from the sheep. So you can start creating your own model. So I invite you to close your eyes for a few minutes. And I want you to begin breathing in deeply at your own pace. Right down into your belly. At your own pace. And just for a few moments, pay attention to your breathing. Just try to differentiate, as you breathe in and out through your nostrils, the difference in temperature between the in-breath and the out-breath. Just focus on that difference for a few moments as you breathe. And as you breathe in, I want you to imagine this fresh, oxygenated blood coursing throughout your body, healing every part of you and relaxing every part of you. All the ways from the top of your head down to the soles of your feet. And every time you breathe in, you bring in this healing spirit energy. In many, many languages, the same word means breath and life and spirit. So every breath, in fact, is a recapitulation, a reincarnation of your life. And as you breathe out, I invite you to let go of any tension that you're experiencing in any part of your body or any part of your psyche. In breath, you take in spirit. Out breath, you let go of any tension or distress or discomfort. And in that relaxed space, I'm going to take you on a little journey. I want you to imagine that you're in a meadow and you're barefoot on a lovely sunny day. And you can feel the grass underfoot, soft like a carpet. And you can hear the song of the birds. And you feel a gentle breeze on your face. And at the other end of the meadow, you see this great ancient oak tree. And you begin walking across towards it. And as you approach it, you reach out your hand to touch the gnarled bark. And all of a sudden, a magical doorway swings outwards open. And you realize it's hollow inside, and you can step inside. And you find yourself at the top of a great oak spiral staircase. And you close the door behind you, but the interior is infused with this really beautiful, warm, welcoming, golden light. And you put your hand on the rail, and you wind yourself down deeper and deeper and deeper, until you come to this long, elegant corridor with rooms opening to the right and to the left. I want you to choose one door and to enter the room. And you find yourself in an extraordinary archive, a library of experiences, your life experiences. And on one wall there's this great matrix drawn, 5 columns and many rows. The first column is your age, 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, etc. The second column is the question, who was God for you during each of these segments? The third column asks, whom did you believe yourself to be during each of these segments? Thirdly, who was neighbor to you? What was your understanding of neighbor during each of these segments? And then the final column, what was your understanding of your purpose or mission during each of these segments? So for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to remain completely silent, and I want you to fill in all of those pieces, and then trace how your notion of God evolved, how your notion of self evolved, how your notion of neighbor evolved, and how your notion of mission evolved. And I invite you to ask yourself a few further questions before we finish. When you look at the trajectory in each of those categories, who is God, who am I, who is neighbor, what is mission? Is it flatlining? Is it just a straight drop or a straight climb? Is it oscillating in some way? Is there growth or development, or are you stuck? And if you wanted to make a change for 2018, where might you start? And now at your own pace, I invite you to bring your attention and your awareness back into this room and this time, and when you're ready, just open your eyes.